Some receivers are finally rounding into mid-season form while others are leaving fantasy owners frustrated. From breakout stars to boom or bust candidates, here's how the top 36 wideouts line up for Week 11. What's up, Headliner Nation? My name is Brad, the Rankings King, and before we dive into this week's rankings, just a reminder that these are the consensus rankings from the Headliners team. And for more detailed analysis, make sure to check out those start-sit videos from Kyle already posted on the channel this week. And if you want even more breakdowns each week, join the Fantasy Headliners community by hitting that join button below. That's going to get you access to extra rankings like flex, kicker, defense, and a spot inside of our Discord. Now, before we look at Week 11, we've got a few hits and misses at the wide receiver position from Week 10. So we'll start with our hits, and we look at Ladd McConkey, Nico Collins, and Rome Odunze. And Ladd McConkey, we committed to his recent production, and we kept him inside of the top 12, and that's exactly where he ended up finishing. And then we look at Nico Collins and Rome Odunze. Both Nico and Rome may get the most comments weekly, like, why are they so high? Why you have them so high in the rankings? But it's because you don't give up on really good players, and so we kept them inside of the top 12, and guess what, baby? Finished inside the top 12. Okay, but what about our misses? And we start with Alec Pierce, and it's so hard to rely on big play 50-50 balls, but he got them once again, and so we had him too low in the rankings. And then what about Courtland Sutton? Listen, Denver may be one of the most annoying offenses in the NFL. They just stopped committing to Sutton, and we had him too high. He's about to fall hard. And then next up is Michael Pittman, and he's been the top receiver in one of the league's best offenses, but Atlanta took him out of the picture, and JT took over, so we had Pittman too high in Week 10. All right, that's it for our hits and misses. Now let's turn the page to Week 11. In Tier 1, we've got Ja'Marr Chase, Puka Nacua, Jackson Smith and Jigba, CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Drake London, Nico Collins, Rashee Rice, and Justin Jefferson. At number 1, we have Ja'Marr Chase, and the overall wide receiver 3 gets a matchup against Pittsburgh, who allows the second most fantasy points to wide receivers. And when these two teams faced off a couple weeks ago, he had 23 targets, 16 receptions, 161 yards, and a touchdown against them. At number 2, we have Puka Nacua, and the yardage and volume has really dipped over his last 4 games. Luckily, he keeps finding the end zone, though, with touchdowns in 4 of his last 5. With Adams slightly banged up, I could see him getting 12-plus targets this week against Seattle. At number 3, we have Jackson Smith and Jigba, and let's just be glad that he doesn't have to play Arizona anymore. His 2 lowest yardage games of the year both came against the Cardinals. Now, he still had a great game, but this matchup against the Rams this week won't be a walk in the park. At number 4, we have CeeDee Lamb, and the Cowboys offense has sputtered the last couple of weeks, but now they're fresh off the bye with a matchup going up against Vegas, who allows over 30 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. This could easily be another 100-yard game for CeeDee Lamb. At number 5, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown, and in a matchup this week against Philly, there's a chance that this turns into a back-and-forth offensive slugfest. The biggest concern is that it's been easier to run on Philly than throw on them for the most part this season. At number 6, we have Drake London, and he is on a serious hot streak right now. He's now had 100-plus yards in 4 of his last 5, as well as 58 targets and 6 touchdowns over that same span. Now, Carolina crushed them back in Week 3, and they allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers, so there is a little bit of risk here. At number 7, we have Nico Collins, and it doesn't matter if it's CJ Stroud or Mills. What matters is the targets. He's had 36 over the last 3 games. You can't score fantasy points without touches, and wide receivers can't get touches without targets. Now he'll get a Tennessee team that allows almost 30 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. At number 8, we have Rashee Rice, and he is fresh off the bye, and he scored 16-plus fantasy points in all 3 of his games this year. The matchup against Denver, though, isn't easy. They allow the fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers, but right now, Patrick Surtain is still questionable to play, and that would help if he misses again. At number 9, we have Justin Jefferson, and Jefferson with McCarthy is just average, like just a guy, not a high tier option like we've had. He hasn't had over 80 yards in a game in a month and only has 1 touchdown since week 1. Luckily, this is a great matchup though against Chicago, who allows the 4th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. All right, that's it for tier 1. And before we head into the next tier, I want to make sure that you're all hooked up on Underdog. You already know that we're crushing those player pick'ems on Underdog this year. So what are you waiting for? Head over to Underdog Fantasy or download the app. app. Create a new account using the referral code Headliners when you do so. Then just make your initial deposit and come join a contest. If you sign up with that promo code, again, it's Headliners, you'll get access to all of the promos that Underdog offers weekly. And check this out. When you play your first $5, they're going to give you $100 in bonus funds. So you play 5, you get 100. It's that easy. And don't forget that Jake is going to be breaking down the best picks weekly in our show on Fridays. So links to join are in the description, and we look forward to playing with you this week. All right, let's turn the page to Tier 2. We have Emeka Egbuka, Jalen Waddle, George Pickens, Ladd McConkey, Rome Odunze, T. Higgins, Davante Adams, and Devontae Smith. At number 10, we have Emeka Egbuka, and great game for him last week, coming off of the bye and putting up over 100 yards and a touchdown against the Patriots. More importantly, he's had at least 9 targets now in 3 straight games, and they'll need to heavily target him to beat Buffalo this week. At number 11, we have Jalen Waddle, and he's continued to be a solid high-end wide receiver 2 for weeks. The ceiling hasn't been crazy high, but this is a great matchup against Washington, who allows the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. At number 12, we have George Pickens, and Pickens continues to score 10-plus fantasy points per game, even with CeeDee Lamb on the other side. He's also done it in back-to-back weeks against some solid defenses like Denver and Arizona. Now he gets Vegas, which will be the easiest matchup that he's had as of late. At 13, we have Ladd McConkey, and McConkey has once again returned to being the safest weekly play in LA. He's had touchdowns in 4 of his last 6 and has had a reception of at least 20 yards or more in 4 of his last 5. Now he gets another great matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars. At number 14, we have Rome Odunze, and listen, I know there's been some frustrations as of late with Rome. He's still the wide receiver 13 on the year, though, and if not for a couple of dropped touchdowns and a few penalties, he'd be up inside the top 5. We're hoping that he can find the end zone again this week like he did against Minnesota in week 1. At number 15, we have T. Higgins, and we all know that Chase exploded in his last game against Pittsburgh, but don't forget that Higgins also had 96 yards and a touchdown that game as well. Now they come off of the bye against that Pittsburgh team, who allows the 2nd most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. At number 16, we have Davante Adams, and right now at the time of this recording, he's currently questionable to play. McVay has already said that he could have returned to the game last week if he had been needed. He has 6 touchdowns over the last 3 games, and he's the wide receiver 6 on the season, so I know that we need him out there. At number 17, we have Devontae Smith, and they for sure like Smith more than Brown in Philly. He's had 7-plus targets and at least 80 yards receiving or a touchdown in 4 of his last 5. Now they get a Detroit team who's easier to throw on than run on, so look for another big play this week. Okay, that's it for Tier 2. Now let's look at Tier 3. We have Stefon Diggs, DK Metcalf, Quentin Johnston, Jameson Williams, Zay Flowers, Jawan Jennings, Jordan Addison, Deebo Samuel, and Ted McMillan. At 18, we have Stefon Diggs, and all the other receiving options are soaking up the yardage, but Diggs is the guy scoring touchdowns. He's had 1 in 3 straight games, and now he gets a matchup against the Jets, who just made Jerry Jeudy look good in week 10. At number 19, we have DK Metcalf, and all of those touchdowns that we had to start the season have dried up for DK Metcalf. He's only had 1 over the last month. And on paper, this matchup is great against Cincinnati, but it was also just 4 weeks ago that he only had 3 catches for 50 yards against them. At number 20, we have Quentin Johnston, and obviously with the play of McConkey as of late, the production of QJ is going to take a hit. He hasn't had over 55 yards in a game since week 4. The Jags allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, though, so he could have a chance at bouncing back this week. At number 21, we have Jameson Williams, and Dan Campbell starts calling plays, and all of a sudden, Jameson Williams has his best game of the season. Don't be surprised if he makes a late second half run, and they will definitely need him against Philly this week. At number 22, we have Zay Flowers, and if this dude could get a touchdown every once in a while, he would be top 15, but he hasn't had one since week 1, and he just hovers in that 8 to 12 fantasy point per game range. It's worth noting, though, that his season high in targets came in week 2 against this Cleveland Browns team. At number 23, we have Jauan Jennings, and just when it looks like Jauan Jennings is starting to get healthy and produce more, there's a chance that Ricky Pearsall returns. If Pearsall plays, then Jennings falls down the rankings. If Pearsall sits, he'll be right here as a Verge wide receiver 2. At number 24, we have Jordan Addison, and only 3 receptions on 11 targets with 0 drops tells me that the majority of his volume isn't even catchable. He now hasn't had more than 3 receptions in a game for 3 weeks, but there's no denying that this is a great matchup against the Chicago Bears. At number 25, we have Deebo Samuel, and everything down the field has just stopped for Deebo Samuel. He's failed to get more than 50 total yards now in 4 straight games. He's become pretty matchup dependent, and the Dolphins allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. At number 26, we have Ted McMillan, and the Carolina passing game just continues to struggle. They haven't scored more than 16 points in a game for a month. Even the last time that they played Atlanta and won 30-0, Ted only had 48 yards receiving. It's hard to rank him much higher right now. All right, that's it for Tier 3. Now let's look at Tier 4. We have Khalil Shakir, A.J. Brown, Tez Johnson, Christian Watson, Courtland Sutton, Wan'Dale Robinson, Parker Washington, Troy Franklin, Darius Slayton, and Jakobi Meyers. At 27, we have Khalil Shakir, and Shakir's numbers haven't been great, but with both Josh Palmer and Dalton Kincaid questionable to play, we could see him with 8+ targets once again this week against Tampa. At number 28, we have A.J. Brown, and Brown has been an absolute disaster majority of the season. He's on our yearly do not draft list, but even he himself is out there telling people to drop him in fantasy, and that's never a good sign. At number 29, we have Tez Johnson, and touchdown Tez continues to be a factor. He's had 4 touchdowns over his last 4 games. Now, he is reliant on those touchdowns since he hasn't even had 60 yards in a game yet, but there's still nothing pointing to him not being able to score another one this week. At number 30, we have Christian Watson, and deja vu in week 10. Minimal volume, but 2 plays over 20 yards. He's highly reliant on those deeper shots down the field, but with Golden and Dobbs banged up, he could see those shots against a Giants defense that allows almost 30 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. At number 31, we have Courtland Sutton, and what's crazy about Sutton is that he's doing right now what we expected him to do at the start of the season. We actually had him in the bust section of our draft guide, and he's only had 1 touchdown since week 4, and now he gets a tough matchup against Kansas City. At number 32, we have Wan'Dale Robinson, and Jameis Winston over Russ is great news for Robinson. We know that the run game is non-existent, and Jameis wants to throw the ball. Robinson has 38 targets over the last 4 weeks, and he should be the check down option this week for Jameis. At number 33, we have Parker Washington, and with Travis Hunter done for the year and Brian Thomas questionable to play, we should once again be looking at around at least 8 targets for Washington in week 11. Unfortunately, though, it's another tough matchup this week against LA. At 34, we have Troy Franklin, and he may not be able to catch all the targets thrown his way, but he's catching the valuable ones. He has 37 targets and 4 touchdowns over the last 4 weeks. We're hoping that he's able to find a little bit of space with Kansas City's main focus being on Courtland Sutton. At number 35, we have Darius Slayton, and Slayton getting Jameis Winston instead of Russell Wilson is a huge bonus as well. Slayton is reliant on the deep ball, and Jameis likes to throw the football deep. The connection isn't guaranteed, but at least there's more of a chance with Jameis. At number 36, we have Jakobi Meyers, and 3 catches for 41 yards in his first game as a Jag against a tough Houston defense. It's not bad. You have to expect that his role is going to grow, though, and they're going to need him against a high-powered LA offense here in Week 11. Okay, so there's your top 36 in tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we've got a couple of guys on the outside looking in. And Trey Tucker, Xavier Worthy, Romeo Dobbs, DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, and Rashid Shaheed. And that'll do it for our Week 11 wide receiver rankings. And every decision counts right now, so make sure that you got the right guys in your lineup. Tell us your toughest start, sit, call in the comments. Hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for every position ranking all season long. Headliner Nation, we'll see you in the next video.
Analytics off the chain, 12 channels,